Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this evening for the third lecture in the lecture series of the Palestine Land Studies Center here at AUB. It's a pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Nadia Abu El-Haj, who is actually a member of our advisory group for the Palestine Land Studies Center. It's really a pleasure to have you, Nadia, here. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Allow me a very brief introduction that will not do justice to Nadia's accomplishments, but I think it's important to briefly note her work. Dr. Nadia Abu El-Haj is the Ann Olin Whitney Professor in the Departments of Anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University. She co-directs the Center for Palestine Studies and chairs the governing board of Columbia's Society of Fellows at the Heyman Center for Humanities. She's the author of numerous articles and recipients of very prestigious awards, including those from the Social Science Research Council, the MacArthur Foundation, the Harvard Academy for Area and International Studies, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. Dr. Abu El-Haj is the author of 2 books, Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practices and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society, which won the Albert Hourani Annual Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association in 2002, and the Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins in the Politics of Epistemology from 2012. Her third and much awaited book is a study of contemporary American militarism as it operates in and through the idiom of trauma. Today, we have the honor to host Dr. Abu El-Haj to lecture on the trouble of the archive. Nadia, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give a talk at AUB. I'm sorry I can't be in Beirut with you, although I know you are all going through a very difficult time in many ways. And I realize it's hard to listen to someone talk over Zoom, but I will do my best. Okay, so Jerusalem, sometime after the 1967 war, a construction crew was digging at the site of my grandfather's hotel. They opened up the ground and came upon a mosaic beneath their feet. If the Israel Antiquities Authority got whiff of its existence, construction would be stopped, at the very least temporarily. Far more troublesome, my grandfather could lose his land. This was East Jerusalem. Classifying a place as an antiquity site was one known means of land seizure, and it remained so. My grandfather told the workers to cement over the find immediately. As I remember it, my father told me that story, though I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps it wasn't about my grandfather at all. It might have happened to a family friend. Regardless, the scenario is neither implausible nor uncommon in East Jerusalem. For Palestinians living under Israeli rule, the underground portends an existential threat. The underground. In the Zionist imaginary, it is an archive in its own right. Therein lies the deep history of Jewish presence on the land on which Zionist ideology depends. Archaeology is not the only archive of Jewish origins in Palestine, of course. As I wrote about in my second book, so too has race science, population genetics, and more recently, genetic history been turned to as a site, as an archive, for rendering legible the facts of Jewish origins. History and the archive are important to all nationalist projects, of course, but they took on particular significance and form in this settler colony that imagined itself as a nation returning home. In my talk today, I discuss the struggle over history in Israel and Palestine within the context of thinking about the power of a widespread commitment to what Joan Scott has called the judgment of history. That is, and I quote, an abiding faith, at least for the general public, if not for all professional historians, that in the end, we will be vindicated by history, that truth will eventually be recognized, unquote. More specifically, I'm interested in that abiding faith as a left liberal, and anti-colonial politics. Most generally, I ask, given the now widely accepted aphorism that knowledge is power, in actual practice, does or how does knowing inform politics today? I begin with an account of the archaeological archive that grounded Jewish national return as historical truth, paying attention to the kind of historical archive that archaeology produces and its epistemological felicity for a settler colony, imagined in nationalist terms. Next, I discuss projects of counterhistory and the importance, the implicit promise perhaps, of reading against the archival grain and of producing either counter archives for post-colonial scholarship and post and anti-colonial politics. And finally, I critically engage that promise and suggest that we may be living in an era in which we need to consider the aphorism and the social theory that knowledge is power. Recuperating a counter history, more broadly knowing the facts, getting them right, may make little political difference at all, and not just in the context of the struggle over Palestine. Let me begin with a brief sketch of archaeology as an archive for the project of Jewish settler nationhood. Okay. During the late 19th century, European and American explorers come geographers came to Palestine in search of a biblical past. The London based Palestine Exploration Society mapped the land in order to locate or to identify, in their rhetoric, biblical stories on its surface. This was a scientific qua religious and, of course, colonial quest, driven by a Christian and more precisely a Protestant theological imaginary. They sought to establish the historicity of the Bible, and they began by reading surface level signs of biblical stories and so-called events. Over time, practices of cartography produced Palestine as a concrete, coherent, and historic place. And they established the intellectual grounds for excavations to come. Surface level identifications enabled the excavation of now known biblical sites to proceed. By the early 20th century, mapping had given way to the archaeological dig, and biblical archaeology came into its own as a scientific discipline. The underground was made to reveal truth and specific forms of truth, hitherto not visible or available on the land's surface. If Protestant practitioners dug to establish the veracity of Christian theology, the Jewish Palestine Exploration Society during the British Mandate and Israeli archaeologists after 1948 dug in search of empirical evidence of biblical accounts of Israelite and Jewish settlement and sovereignty in ancient Palestine. Archaeological facts would substantiate a nationalist project. That is, they would verify the truth of an ideology that framed colonial settlement as a project of national return. Excavating was part and parcel of an ongoing practice of conquest, kibush in Hebrew, and it's a term that had positive, not negative connotations. That practice of conquest would render a Jewish sovereign present on the land, past and present, visible in concrete form. Mapping, surveying, and excavating assembled material symbolic facts that revealed the land's identity as the Jewish national home, often prior to and in anticipation of the actual settlement or seizure of specific places within it. An archive of ancient Jewish present was made, in other words, and to echo Derrida's description of the temporality of the archive, we now know what that archive has come to have meant. This place is Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. History, as sensibility, fervor, and pursuit was essential to nationalisms and to the birth of nationalisms in the 19th century, and Zionism was no exception. For its part, archaeology emerged as a distinctive iteration of the modern historical imaginary and the practice of history, and it spoke to a project of settler nationhood in a particularly powerful way. Archaeologists do far more than generate narrative accounts of the past, after all. They do not go to already established archives and sort through documents that ended up there, whether by intention or by chance. Much like ethnographers in Bronislaw Malinowski's imagination and in his methodological directive, archaeologists generate the historical archive on which their analyses and narratives are subsequently built. More specifically, they produce material cultural objects and architectures out of which landscapes and architectures are made. Contemporary architectures, historical signs then live on the landscape for all to see. In excavating Palestine's biblical past, the Jewish Palestine Exploration Society and subsequently Israeli archaeological institutions sought to establish the nation's origin story and its right to sovereignty in this particular place. And they did so by assembling material objects that stood on the ground as evidence of a prior Israelite in Jewish presence and sovereignty. In other words, not only was the identity of the Jews as a historical people at stake, so too was the identity of the land. Archaeology inscribed a specific biography for the land itself, a story of its own lost Israelite and Jewish past. And the land itself, and not just the people, then had a right to become once more what it always already was, that is, the land of Israel. Settler colonizers in the Americas, in Africa, in Australia, they imagined the lands they conquered as terra nullius, as empty land. In response, one powerful anti-colonial gesture has been to recuperate the pre-colonial past, to establish a history of the prior. What communities and states or histories were forged on and through the land that settlers declared empty. In support of legal battles over Indigenous land title in Australia, for example, producing evidence of deep and continuous life worlds tethered to the land has been one way of trying to hold the settler nation to account, to demand rights to the land, to call for reparations and repair. That is a counter-historical project, and it is also a counter-cartographic one. What other places of cultural and historical significance are traceable on lands imagined to be empty? A counter-archaeological sensibility can also be harnessed to challenge settler historical claims. To take one example, the Palestinian architect and artist Dima Srouji produced an installation for the Sharjah Architectural Triennial in November 2019, titled Depth Unknown. The installation focused on the Palestinian village, an archaeological site of Sebastia. Excavations at Sebastia, located on what is believed to be the biblical city of Samaria, commenced in the early 20th century under the auspices of Harvard University. What it has come to have meant, to return to Derrida's formulation of the archive, is summarized in Srouji's words, I quote, "Today, the Israeli government encourages Israeli settlers carrying weapons to enter Sebastia for mass religious tourism. The tourists use the archaeological monuments as a stage set to perform the singular narratives of ancient Samaria. Bulldozers are used throughout the archaeological site to destroy the small Palestinian-owned businesses in the site," unquote. In fact, the presence of the archaeological site of Samaria was one rationale for including the village and its lands in Area C, that is, the regions of the West Bank left under full control under the Oslo Accords. Depth Unknown, as the installation, refuses this fixing of the land's identity in its biblical past. It sets out to imagine an historical otherwise, to use Theodore Adorno's felicitous term. The installation was designed to produce, quote, an architectural imaginary of the constantly shifting Palestinian ground, making visible disregarded strata, displaced objects, and the entangled narratives of Palestine, in other words. There is more than one history here. Depth Unknown asks, quote, what would the ground of Palestine say if it were allowed to recuperate, if it were allowed its own independent voice? The struggle to recuperate an historical otherwise in the context of the anti-colonial struggle of Palestine confronts a distinct settler imaginary. I want to emphasize here. Palestine was never imagined as terra nullius in the same way as were other settler colonies. In speaking for the land, the Zionist imaginary told a story of Jewish indigeneity. Jews, not Palestinians, are indigenous to this place. Zionism staked its exceptionalism. This is not a colonial project. This is a nation returning home on that originary claim. And evidence for that claim was forged by digging down, far enough down into the earth. If Palestine was terra nullius on its surface, a civilizational history, a story of Jewish origins and indigeneity was embedded deep in its underground. Contesting this project of settler colonialism then poses particular kinds of challenges. When the settler appropriates the status of the indigenous, what might a counterclaim to the prior look like? One might hearken back to an even earlier origin story. This is the land of Canaan, a move made by few but not many in Palestine, a fact that in and of itself demonstrates, at least I think it does, the lack of an anxiety amongst Palestinians about whether or not they really belong in this place. One might frame a deep and enduring history, all of it, as part of not just a Palestinian self, but also of a global cultural heritage entrusted to Palestine, as the PA is trying to do in having UNESCO declare Samaria a World Heritage Site. Alternatively, one might reject the turn to deep history and focus on more recent centuries, quite centrally on documenting the histories of villages destroyed in 1948. Think, for example, of Walid Khaldi's All That Remains. Such reconstructions establish a counter-archive, such as the one the Palestine Land Center has assembled. Maps, books, aerial photographs, all dating to the time before. That is, evidence of life worlds that existed prior to the victory of Zionist settler nationhood. And finally, one might follow the challenge of post-colonial scholarship and learn to read against the archival grain. Let me turn now to talk about reading against the archival grain. In a variety of disciplines, and quite centrally in anthropology and history, post-colonial scholars have insisted over the last several decades on the importance of revisiting the colonial archive and reading it against the grain. What kinds of reading practices enable one to recover the history of the colonized? How does one read absences and silences? In short, how does one produce a counter-history of colonialism? Writing in the 1990s, the late anthropologist Rolf Trouillot explored various kinds of historical silences produced by the colonial archive. Yes, he argued, as post-colonial scholars have shown, colonial archives have silenced the histories of the colonized. But he insisted there is more than one way in which archives produce silences that need to be pried apart. I'm going to focus on one of his examples, or one way in which silences are produced. In the case of the Haitian Revolution, Trouillot identifies a particular iteration of silence, not just retrospectively, but as the events unfolded in real time. The Haitian Revolution was unthinkable. It was what he calls an impossible history. Revolution is an act of politics. Slaves were not manned, ergo slaves were not capable of this distinctly human act. As such, Trouillot argues, each instance of rebellion is cast in the archive as motivated by the frustrations or pathologies of an individual slave. Their acts are not representing as adding up to a whole, that is, to a collective act. This kind of archival silence, Trouillot argues, indexes an ontological impasse. Given that particular capacities belong to some forms of being and not others, slaves as not man could not be political actors. The question of whether Palestinians were civilized enough, capable of self-rule, echoes through the project of British rule and Jewish settlement in Palestine, even if this was not an ontological impasse of the same order that Trouillot describes. Less civilized, certainly, but Palestinians were not property. They were not, strictly speaking, not man. Nevertheless, they were perhaps man of an inferior kind. But I want to take up the question of ontology here in a different register. What if we stretch the question of ontological possibility and impossibility beyond Trouillot's focus on historical actors and considered the ontological status of evidence? In other words, I want to think about the relationship between the epistemological status of evidence, how reliable, credible, or authoritative it is taken to be, and its myriad forms, as written documents, as material traces or objects, as the memories and oral accounts of particular subjects. What evidence is there, or what might count or be authorized as evidence of an enduring Palestinian presence in and right to this place? Eyal Weizman has argued that, quote, the mode of operation of contemporary colonialism is to erase the traces of its own violence, unquote. That was certainly true of the Israeli state during and after the War of 1948, when the vast majority of Palestinian villages were destroyed. That destruction sought not only to make return impossible, it also strove to cleanse the landscape of material traces of other claims to belonging, ownership, and sovereign right. Digging down through stratum after stratum, so too did Israeli archaeology destroy material cultural remains of others, other religious, cultural, and civilizational claims, other forms of life, on its way down to the biblical scene, leaving, as Dimas Ruji puts it, a void in its wake. How does one reemerge from that void, so to speak? What kinds of evidence and whose evidence has the power to narrate? I'm going to move here to think about the ethics of history and historical memory. Quote, is it possible that the antonym of forgetting is not remembering, but justice, unquote? The historian Chaim Yerushalmi asks. In Yerushalmi's question, we hear a torquing of the modern historical sensibility that emerged in the 19th century. Yes, the past, as memories, documents, objects, genes even, is still taken to reveal who we really are. That, after all, is why and how history emerged as so central to 19th century nationalisms. In its late 20th and early 20th century iteration, however, something more is going on. This is a command. Remember, you must remember, lest historical, that is man-made, as distinct from transcendental evil, reappear. In A.L. Weizmann's words, quote, confronting denial is important because denial in all its multiple forms is the condition of possibility for violence to be perpetrated in the future, unquote. By the second half of the 20th century, remembering was framed as a decidedly ethical act in the Euro-American imaginary. It characterizes a powerful post-Holocaust sensibility. As Joan Scott writes in her account of the Nuremberg trials that followed the Second World War, quote, U.S. Associate Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, promised to document and punish the sinister influence of National Socialism in a way that would make it at once unforgettable and unrepeatable, unquote. Unforgettable, unrepeatable. That is, in her words, what the judgment of history is supposed to be, what it is supposed to promise. Let me quote Scott at length. I began to think about the notion of the judgment of history in 2017 during the Charlottesville riots, where Confederate flags flew and swastikas appeared in large numbers, and when Heil Hitler salutes welcomed white supremacist Richard Spencer's inflammatory orations on campuses across the country. Remember, this is the summer after Trump gets elected. There's this widespread white supremacist riot in Charlottesville where one woman ends up dead. That's what she's referring to. I continue the quote. Hadn't the Nazis been declared losers of World War II and morally out of bounds? Wasn't never again the promise of the Nuremberg and later Eichmann trials? What had become of the idea that the evil of Nazism was banished forever from the political stage? I'm still quoting, listening to the chants of the torch-bearing Ku Klux Klan reenactors, I thought, didn't the Civil War end slavery not only as a practice, but as an acceptable idea? Hadn't the civil rights movement made racial equality a national aspiration, if not a reality? The lack of any shame at the public avowal of these ideas suggests not just defiance, she writes, but refusal of what was supposed to have been history's judgment, unquote. History, of course, is never simply a matter of what happened. As Scott caveats to her own reaction, quote, I know that there is no closure for history, no single story that can be told, unquote. History is made at one and the same time of socio-historical processes and their narrativization, as Trujillo insists. With regard to the question of Palestine, Edward Said argued in 1984, central to the struggle has been enduring fight for the permission to narrate, or what I might reword as the power to narrate. And one, perhaps the central sticking point in that permission or power has been the founding event of the Israeli state, that is, the War of 1948. The Nakba, the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their villages and cities during the war, was widely discussed among Palestinians. In living memory, people knew what had happened to them, to their parents and their grandparents, to their towns, villages, and life worlds, even as Israeli politicians, historians, and the public writ large continued to deny their truth. While recounted by Palestinian scholars on the basis of both documents and oral histories, for decades after the war, this other history was silenced and dismissed, not just in Israel, of course, but throughout the Euro-American world. That, however, was to shift. With the declassification in 1978 of documents pertaining to Israel's so-called War of Independence, the facts, the authorized facts more accurately, were to change. Israeli historians gained access to previously unavailable documents, to state secrets, and a few began to rewrite the history of their state. On the basis of this newly available documentary evidence, they challenged hegemonic narratives regarding its founding moment, Most fundamentally, historians such as Benny Morris and Ilan Pape, who are actually politically quite different, to name but two, argued that Palestinians did not leave their homes at will or under orders from Arab regimes. They were driven out. They were expelled by Zionist brigades during the war. There were disagreements among these so-called new historians and on the part of Palestinian scholars who continued to challenge them. Was the expulsion intentional, pre-planned, essential to the establishment of the Jewish state, or was it an event that unfolded during the chaos or the fog of war? Despite these rather significant disagreements, however, the basic parameters of that new history came to be widely accepted in the Israeli Academy. There's no self-respecting historian in Israel today that doesn't know those facts, and even quite widely in the Israeli public domain. During its War of Independence, Zionist militias perpetrated substantial violence and harm against the land's Palestinian population. The civilian population was expelled so that the Jewish state could be established and its borders expanded. And in fact, there was this TV footage just last week from the recent riot of the right-wing settlers in East Jerusalem over the project to take over Sheikh Jarrah. So there was footage of an Israeli television reporter interviewing some of the settlers or Israelis about expelling the Arabs. And one of them responded quite bluntly, he said, well, it's expelling Arabs from Sheikh Jarrah, he said, is no different than what was done in 1948. They're acting in concert with what has been done before. By the mid-1980s, this so-called post-Zionist scholarship seemed to portend a promise. The facts were out there. Archival evidence, now in the hands of Israeli historians, demonstrated what Palestinians already knew. Post-Zionism was emerging as a term and a politics. The first intifada was unfolding on the ground. There was a cautious optimism in the air, at least early on, that a political solution, imagined at the time as a two-state solution, would be achieved. Might a Palestinian historical narrative become widely intelligible, more authoritative? Might the facts on the ground actually change? Were we at a turning point in the Palestinian struggle against the Israeli state? Let's jump 2 decades hence. Beginning in the early years of the new millennium, teams sent by the Security Department of Israel's Defense Ministry began to pour through documents in Israeli archives in order to remove some of them from public view. Formally available, that is, previously declassified documents, were resealed into the vaults of state secrecy. Quote, I actually want to pause here and say the same thing happened in the US after 9/11. All these previously declassified documents, particularly about weaponry, were resealed into state security. And likewise, and it's worth noting that they were still often available because they'd been downloaded from webs, et cetera, and yet the same project went on. Okay, and I'm quoting here. Hundreds of documents have been concealed as part of a systematic effort to hide evidence of the Nakba, unquote, one Haaretz journalist reported. Quite specifically, the main document on the basis of which Benny Morris published his first essay in 1986, which is considered seminal to the field of post-Zionist history, it's called The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947 to 1949. That document was disappeared. The reporter, the Haaretz reporter, posed the following question to Nadia Abu El-Haj, who was the former head of the IDF Security Department. Quote, Benny Morris has already written about that document, so what's the logic of keeping it hidden, unquote. El-Haj responds, I don't remember the document you're referring to, but if he quoted it and the document itself is not there, i.e. where Morris says it is, then his facts aren't strong. If he says, yes, I have the document, I can't argue with that. But if he says it's written there, that could be right and it could be wrong. There's a difference of day and night in terms of the validity of the evidence, unquote. The status and authority of the written word returns with a vengeance here. In the absence of the original document, El-Haj is saying, what could possibly count as proof? Documents in this ontology are objects whose presence or absence all the epistemological and, more importantly, presumably thereby political difference make. They transform a matter of fact, or their absence transforms a matter of fact into a matter of dispute. Chorev is not wrong. As material objects, as presumably objective official sources from Israeli archives, they have an epistemological authority that is not conferred on Palestinian accounts and memories. Palestinians in their very being, by definition, are unreliable witnesses to their own experiences of colonization and war in this colonial imaginary. And it's worth emphasizing their unreliability as witnesses stands in stark contrast in Israeli society and in the West to the presumed credibility of the Holocaust survivor as witness to genocide. A reality that has its origins in the Heyman trial, if one looks back, which took place, of course, in Jerusalem under Ben Gurion's rule, if one looks back at Hannah Arendt's account. The unreliable witness, to return to the question of Palestinians, that is the, or one of the Palestinian subjects' ontological differences in this settler imaginary. Nevertheless, the relationships among matters of fact, of knowing, and matters of power and politics are more complex than Chorev and the Israeli state's anxiety suggests. Simply put, even in the face of the empirical facts, the Nakba remains an impossible history, to return to Trouillot's words. The facts are out there, but no recognition of their ethical significance, and as such, no political consequences have followed suit. Let me keep the focus here on Israeli liberals, rather than on the more fascist iteration of the state and its settlers. After all, the latter is an easy target for us and a reliable alibi for Israeli liberals who want to place the blame elsewhere. By the early 2000s, for example, Benny Morris had turned from a reluctant post-Zionist to a staunch defender of the War of 1948. All nations are founded in violence. Israel is no exception. It had to be done, he declared. And in taking that position, he was not alone. Several years after Morris's recantation, a prominent left-leaning Israeli columnist published a journalistic account of Israel's founding and its contemporary political impasses. His book, My Promised Land, is also Ari Shavit, that's his name, his ethical reckoning, which he says explicitly, with the violence against Palestinians on which the state was built. I want to stop and note that the book was published to wide acclaim in the US, although not in Britain, and reviewed as a profound and sincere ethical exploration of the state of Israel by one of Israel's most prominent liberal columnists. Okay. Lidda. Lidda, a small city in central Palestine, stands at the heart of Shavit's book. Its inhabitants were expelled during the 1948 war, he writes, but the story of Lidda is even more morally complex for him. This particular Palestinian town endured a massacre. How does a liberal subject grapple with or reconcile himself to that? That's sort of the narrative of the chapter. Lidda and Shavit's narrative stands for a tragic inevitability that was not recognized by the Jewish settlers until it was too late. I quote, "Lidda is our black box. In it lies the secret of Zionism. The truth is that Zionism could not bear Lidda. If Zionism was to be, Lidda could not be. If Lidda was to be, Zionism could not be," unquote. For a good 50 years, he continued, Zionism, quote, succeeded in hiding from itself the substantial contradiction between the Jewish national movement and Lidda. Then, in 3 days in the cataclysmic summer of 1948, contradiction struck and tragedy revealed its face, unquote. Palestinians would have to be forced to leave if the Jewish state was to be born. In Shavit's hands, that fact, however, does not lead to any substantive auto-political critique. It appears as an unfortunate truth for which there is no good answer and certainly no political resolution. Shavit represents Lidda as a tragedy, at once unavoidable and a sign of the Jewish settlers, if only partial, fall from grace. With the massacre in Lidda, Zionism lost its innocence, he states. The massacre might have been avoided, but its conditions of possibility, that is the necessity of conquest and expulsion, were not. He then asks himself rhetorically, do I turn my back on the Jewish national movement that carried out the deed of Lidda? I quote his answer to himself. Like the brigade commander, I'm faced with something too immense to deal with. For when one opens the black box, one understands that whereas the small mosque massacre could have been a misunderstanding brought about by a tragic chain of accidental events, the conquest of Lidda and the expulsion were not accidents. The choice is stark. Either reject Zionism because of Lidda or accept Zionism along with Lidda, unquote. Shavit then tells us he chooses to, quote, stand by the damned, unquote. In sum, Chorev and the Israeli state may be a little too frightened of the power of documents. Recuperating the silences of the archives might not make much difference at all. The Nakba is known, but so what? Here I'm going to come to an end soon. The philosopher Stanley Cavell draws a distinction between what he calls knowing and acknowledging. To borrow that distinction, the stories that the declassified and now partially reclassified documents tell are widely known in Israeli society today. Zionist militias expelled Palestinians from their lands. They even carried out a massacre or two, although the latter fact is a little more disputed than the first. The facts are out there. By and large, they're accepted among the Israeli Jewish public, right and left, and by the American liberal establishment that enthusiastically embraced Shavit's book. Even if known, however, those facts are not acknowledged. In Stanley Cavell's term, what acknowledge means is they do not emerge as matters of public concern and action. They do not appear in such a way as to merit political consideration and judgment. The story of Livda demonstrates that Israel was founded on violence of conquest and expulsion and massacres of its Palestinian population, and in living memory. And yet, Shavit insists there was no other choice and there's nothing to be done. There is no demand here that evil, a historical wrong, be repaired. There is no judgment of history, only the facts. Remembering has no relationship to justice here, in other words, no longer silenced, no longer forgotten. The catastrophe of 1948 carries no ethical, let alone political force. If there is an arc of history here, in Shavit's and Morris's political reckonings, it does not bend towards justice. Yes, the war that Palestinians have long remembered and that Palestinian historians have documented on the basis, among other sources, of the testimony and memories of its survivors is true. That genie isn't going back into any bottle anytime soon. And yet, the Nakba is not a history worthy of consideration and repair. That would require an ethical and political choice. And that choice has a far more tenuous relationship to questions of epistemology, to knowing and to how we know, than those of us on the left might like to believe. In closing, let me return to Yerushalmi's words. Forgetting, he writes, is the opposite of justice, unquote. Well, sometimes. At other times, destroying the historical trace might be precisely what justice demands. Had my grandfather not cemented over the mosaic, he may well have lost his land and livelihood, and for the second time at that. Had the site of biblical Samaria never been identified and excavated, the town of Sebastia, in this retrospective fantasy, just another Palestinian town with no particular biblical significance, might not be encircled by Jewish settlements and might not have remained under a direct Israeli rule. The void, in other words, is not always such a bad thing. At times, justice may require both erasure and forgetting. To be clear, there may well be intrinsic ethical reasons for insisting on recovering other traces of their past. There may be powerful desires for acts of recuperation, regardless of their political consequences. After all, ethics need not be consequentialist. But to insist that forgetting is the opposite of justice, a statement that falls squarely within the grammar of what Joan Scott names the judgment of history, is to operate within a political calculus and rationale that misses a powerful contemporary configuration of colonial power in Israel and Palestine and in other democratic settler nations as well, the US, Canada, et cetera. Settler nationhood no longer depends on the suppression of the historical trace, on the suppression of the anti-colonial truth. It can just as easily operate through the embrace of a far more brazen and explicit seizure of power. Yes, the Nakba, but no, we Israelis don't care. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, so much for the most intellectually stimulating lecture and intervention. I'm sure we will have some time for questions and answers. I know you have a flight to catch, but you offered us some time for interacting with the audience. So I'd like to ask those who have questions to either write them up in the chat, please, or raise their hands so I can call upon them to ask their questions or make their comments as of now, please. And Michael will monitor the chat for any of these questions.
Find a pen.
We'll give the audience a few minutes. You can also unmute and engage directly if you wish, since we don't have many hands up.
Well, as we're waiting, I actually have a brief question. I was wondering, thank you. I was wondering if you could see a similar dynamic in terms of historical erasure and warping the archive around the war in 1967, in terms of the way we remember it in particularly the West and the United States as this kind of defensive measure of everyone teaming up against the Zionists, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, despite all the evidence to the contrary. So I was wondering if there's an interesting dynamic around that as well.
It's an interesting question. I would say, in some ways, cause aside, like why did the War of 1948 happen aside, in some weird way, there's more historical recognition of that expulsion than of 67. And in effect, I think there's the sole question of the origins of 67, I think is still widely understood as a defensive war, that not a war Israel launched, but a war of defense, even in Israel. And I also, interestingly, there's really almost no conversation around the expulsions, like the making of refugees again in 1967. But I think the reason is, because, okay, so let me back up a little bit. This reckoning really was a reckoning of the sort of Israeli liberals, right? Now, it has seeped out so that it's not a widely contested history, and I think for complex reasons, because for the right, they think they're just continuing the war of 1948. They don't care. And for liberals, there's a kind of, it really is this kind of liberal angst. You see what you see in Shavit's book is ultimately it's about him finding a way to be a liberal subject. If he suffers the guilt, he's a liberal subject. He's not like, his enemies, the terrorists who kill and whatever and don't even have guilt. 67 for the liberals has long been there should be a two-state solution, whatever it looks like. So in some sense, it's not as much of a sticking point for the Israeli left because, whatever that form looks like, they have not supported the continued occupation. But I do think it's an interesting question. It's the foundational event that's been the kind of reckoning. And again, 30 years ago, or a little more, the idea that Palestinians were expelled was like incredibly controversial. I'll tell you, Columbia had funding for yet another chair in Israel studies. There were like 13 chairs at Columbia between Jewish and Israel studies, let me just tell you, and one in Arab studies. And this chair was endowed after a recent, this was in the early 2000s, after there was like all this like stuff about how anti-Semitic and blah, 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 the Middle East studies was at Columbia. And I probably shouldn't say this, but I don't really care. And the committee could not agree. They wanted an Israeli historian, but they couldn't agree on one because every reputable Israeli historian was a post-Zionist. Like it was, so there wasn't like a big name in Israeli history that wasn't on some level a post-Zionist, right? And that person was like way too left for Israel and Jewish studies here. And then the other people on it were like, well, maybe it's not gone far enough, but so they ended up hiring a quantitative person who ended up being far more radical than post-Zionist, but they didn't know. But the point is that really was the field. That really has become the field, and yet it doesn't matter. And I think that is really important, right? So what do we do, right? How do you think about a struggle when revealing that historical truth is just, okay, it is what it is, whatever, right? We're not going to go back. We're not going to reconstruct. It was necessary. All nations are founded in violence, et cetera, right?
But maybe, Nadia, one entry point can be through deconstructing this notion of justice, which kind of is used to legitimate this rejection, despite the historical facts. Do you think that this would be an entry point to unarchive what we have already?
What you mean, the notion of justice that is tethered to a post-Holocaust reparation for what happened in Europe?
Yes.
Right. I think that is right. that has to be the entry point of the conversation. I think that's right. And there's a recent volume, I don't know if anyone has seen it, called The Holocaust and the Nakba. That's an edited volume, and it's trying to say, let's put them both on a similar plane. And I responded to that and said, I mean, you can see in the book, there's no way to put them on the similar plane, right? So the real political struggle has to say, the Holocaust cannot be part of this discussion. You have to start with where we're at, right? We are now 60 years into a state. What is the day after going to look like, right? We are settlers gain rights over time. That has happened in every settler nation. So what does it mean to think about Israelis and Palestinians in whatever political form living together? You have to start and move forward, because if you start with that Euro-American imaginary, I think you cannot separate that judgment of history from the Holocaust, because that is ultimately what it's rooted in. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and we have a comment from Dr. Salman Abu Sitta on the chat. He's saying denial is the cornerstone of Zionist ideology. Then he's asking you, as you say, knowing is not acknowledging. Question: if denial becomes the unattainable, would this unroll Zionism, or will it take a new variation?
So I think that's my worry that I've been paying attention to the last couple of years, is I think we're just seeing it morph into a different variation, which is actually a more brutal variation. But again, it's obviously more brutal in its self-owning its own racism, in the sense that the state is moving further and further into this fascist iteration, and what's going on in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah is kind of extraordinary, right? But it's bringing the center and the liberals along. That's what I think. That's what I'm worried about. What do we do if it no longer depends on denial? And again, I don't have an easy answer, but I just think for decades, there was this sense that if one could unravel the denial, then everybody would see, and the opinion of the world would change. And at some level, we are in a moment where, you know, your opinion in Euro-American world is shifting, if not rapidly enough. And I think it will take a long time in the US. So, but I think that it's pulling in both directions. In some sense, the denial is attenuating, so that in the US, there is a possibility of a conversation that didn't exist before, but in the other direction, there's no denial and there's the more, but fine, that's it. I feel guilty, the liberals feel guilty, the other people don't, but this is what we had to do. Every nation has a right to its own state. If you want a Jewish majority state, you had to expel people. And I think we're seeing this pull in both directions. And again, not just on the right. And I think that that presents a particular kind of problem, right?
Yeah. We have a follow-up question from Nadia Spaiti. She's asking, if available evidence no longer matters, what then are the broader implications for changing stakes of having documentary archives in general? And how can we then expand what else can then constitute a literal, figurative archival terrain? This is very important. I mean, as we start the Palestine Land Studies Center, using Dr. Salman Abu Sitta's archives, this is a very important question that I would like to hear an answer.
Yes, so let me say two things. I'm not making the case that therefore these archives are not important. Because again, I think that there are intrinsically ethical reasons why people want to recuperate these counter histories. And there's value in that, right? And I mean, there's value in writing these histories, and there's value in telling these other stories, and we also tell these other stories for ourselves. And again, it's not that it's having, insofar as the conversation in the West is beginning to shift, I do think it's pulling in both directions. So I don't think that archives have to be politically consequentialist or ethically consequentialist to be important. I mean, there's all this work in the US among African-American scholars, right, about reconstructing histories. And this woman, Saidiya Hartman, who's at Columbia, does this, what she calls ficto history or something. I'm making up the word, but it's a combination of using documents and then imagining beyond the documents. So it's partly fiction and partly documentary what slave lives were about. And there's no critical fabulation. Yes, somebody put in the chat, thanks. So I don't want to make that argument, but yes, the question is, so there are two questions. One is, how does one imagine I think the question politically becomes, how does one imagine a future? What is that going to look like, right? And what if we start from the present, right? And the other thing about a figurative archival terrain, I do know that a colleague of mine is actually coming out with a book that's titled something like Archives for a Future. And she's looking at all these Palestinian artists who really are imagining the future, right? So what does it mean to think of an archive in that way? And it's sort of taking critical fabulation forward, right? And trying to imagine what Mahmoud Mamdani once said, the day after. What's it going to look like the day after? What might it look like? So, I've just started sort of writing about this, so I don't really have answers. It's something I'm struggling with. It's just a political moment that makes me, again, in the context of the US, you have all this like quote unquote post-truth, right? Literally Trump and his thing, they make things up and it just goes on. And the response of the left here has been to kind of recuperate the truth. Like, no, we're gonna, right? And part of me thinks like, of course we have to do that. I would never say, let's not try and intervene. But what if it doesn't matter? What if people don't care, right? So it is not a secret. It has not been a secret for a very long time in the US that police kill Black men almost on a daily basis. You can't claim people don't know. The problem is, does it matter? And for a section of the population, it's beginning to be acknowledged. And for another section, they're like, it is what it is, right? So how one intervenes in this political moment, I think, is complicated, right?
Speaking of political moments, Jean Maqdisi asks, what or who exactly is post-Zionist?
Yeah, that's one of those terms. So again, the post-Zionists, and this is why the post-Zionists were never anti-Zionists, right? The people that were anti-Zionist called themselves anti-Zionists and were critical of the establishment of the state as a Jewish state. The post-Zionists they were always sort of more about revealing a kind of truth of what happened in 1948 and trying to think about how the state might have been able to be slightly otherwise, like what would it mean to give Palestinians inside equal rights, but not give up the Jewish state? What would it mean to have a two-state solution? But some of those post-Zionist historians became anti-Zionist. So yes, there's always been a bifurcation there, but the kind of brazenness of coming back 20 years later and saying, actually Ben-Gurion went, not Ben-Gurion, Benny Morris went further than this is, just what it is. He actually said Ben-Gurion, the mistake was he didn't finish the job. That is a shift for these people, right? And it's a shift that again, I think the liberal self-reckoning is important because it's a shift that's rooted in their belief that there's no civilized Palestinian on the other side. So they're caught between the crazy settlers and the crazy Palestinians, and they're the only reasonable people in the room. So there has been a shift there, to the extent that I'm not sure post-Zionist is very meaningful as a political term today, actually.
Okay, thank you so much, Nadia. I cannot thank you enough for a most stimulating and provoking lecture that's going to keep us thinking. And we hope to see you again and again, and maybe in person at AUB next.
That would be lovely.
Thank you so much for engaging us. And I thank all the people who joined us for this session. And
thank you so much for having me and for suffering through yet another Zoom session in your
lives. Was not suffering at all.
Yeah.
We enjoyed it. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everyone. Thank you so much. It will be recorded and also disseminated to those who could not attend. So thank you so much again and again. Thank you. And take care, everyone. Bye-bye.